culture, which is Guanxi. I thought it would be nice to do a cultural episode today because I do get quite a few emails from some of you. And I think one of the questions that I get the most often is, what are the main differences between Western culture and Chinese culture? Obviously, this is a really difficult question to answer because you could literally talk for days about all of the different, minutiae, all the little differences between Chinese culture and Western culture. And it's also something that's quite difficult to understand because there are sort of like macro level differences. Things like food, history, music, those sorts of things. But there are also like micro differences, like the way people treat each other, or like how relationships are formed between people, or at what ages people are expected to do what sort of thing. And then there are like concepts that are like diffuse almost, that are kind of intangible, things like filial piety, that don't really have a one-to-one translation in Western culture. And so all of these things make it quite difficult to just kind of sum up what the differences between the two cultures are, or, generally speaking, between Chinese culture and Western civilization. I thought today it would be nice to try and tackle just one of those topics. So let's dive into exactly what Guanxi is, how it operates in Chinese society, and how it might be having some sort of negative effects both in China and in general in like the business world as well. So let's try and start with a definition. Guanxi is one of those concepts that's like very notoriously difficult to define. There are so many books and articles and blog posts and videos of people trying to define it. It doesn't have a one-to-one concept in Western cultures, or really in a lot of different cultures. But if you're from like a developing country or a country that deals less in sort of like trust in institutions and more like trust in your social network, then you may understand the concept of Guanxi a little bit better. That makes sense. Guanxi is kind of similar to the Western idea of like social connections or network, or not the Western idea, sorry, the English terminology of network. I've come up with my own working definition, kind of a short summary, which is a personal connection between two people that may be used as a resource or tool in a social, work, political, or business context. So the idea behind Guanxi is not just the relationship that you have with someone, but how that relationship can be used either as a means to an end, or just in general throughout your life to support your goals, or just in general so that you can get on with, your everyday and have other people to rely on. It's really hard to define because it's kind of nebulous. I've got another definition from one author that I think kind of clarifies it a little bit. In his book, Guanxi, How China Works, Bian Yanjie says, Guanxi is a potentially resourceful tie. Personalized ties are expected by the parties involved to facilitate exchanges of favors for expressive and instrumental purposes. In a Guanxi tie, one is able to prevail upon another to perform a favor and vice versa. The two parties need not be of equal social status, but they must have access to non-redundant resources to satisfy the exchange of favors. Failure to reciprocate a favor is a violation of mutual obligation and hurts sentimental feelings. Therefore, a close personal tie may quickly lose its instrumental value when the two parties are completely redundant to each other. This is especially so for career-driven people. There are also different layers to Guanxi depending on how you're related to the person. So at a fundamental level, there's like kinship ties and non-kinship ties. So your kinship ties would be, your immediate family members, your in-laws, and distant relatives, people like cousins, second cousins. And then your non-kinship ties would be people like your colleagues, the people that you went to school with, your neighbors, people in your community. So you've got that kind of basic distinction. But just because somebody is your kinship tie, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a good Guanxi relationship with them. Guanxi is something that has to be actively maintained. There are different ways to do it, and we'll sort of go into all the different ways that you can create and maintain Guanxi with someone. But you may actually have a closer Guanxi relationship with somebody that you're not related to, say like an old classmate or a current colleague, or your professor at university who's like your supervisor for your PhD or something like that, than you do, say, with a cousin or an aunt or an uncle or something like that. So non-kinship ties that become like kinship ties are known as ganqin, which kind of means like nominal. kin. So again, it's kind of like if you become really, really close with your professor, then you have this sort of master pupil relationship. And in Confucian terms, that would be considered almost as close as a father-son relationship. So one article sort of expands on this idea of kinship and non-kinship ties as follows. Family, personal, and informal guanxi are relatively more affective, so to do with sort of feelings and emotions, whereas non-family, impersonal, and contractual guanxi are relatively more instrumental, and friends, colleagues, and acquaintances fall in between, although close friendships can be family-like. In the workplace and in business relationships, however, Chinese guanxi tends to be a mixture of family and non-family, personal and impersonal, and expressive and instrumental characteristics. I think a good way of thinking about it is perhaps that your guanxi relationship with somebody can be emotional. It can also be instrumental, so something that's just purely useful, like you guys use each other, or it can be sort of distant. And it basically depends on how useful that tie is to you, either in an emotional sense or, for example, in a career sense or in a political sense. So, for example, we did a recent episode on the National People's Congress. And in that episode, we discussed how one of the major changes that Xi Jinping had made to the government is that now everybody in the top echelons of the government is somebody who he has ties with. Either they used to work together, so one of the main people is his former secretary, or they're from the same province, or they joined the Chinese Communist Party Youth League at the same time. So in the Western press, this was kind of expressed as, oh my god, Xi Jinping is like staffing the entire government with his acolytes and people that only he can trust, and no, they're all yes men and whatever. But in China, this would be seen as like completely normal. Like that's like, of course, you would bring with you the people who that you have an understanding with, that understand you, with whom you've like formed these guanxi ties in the past. So that's kind of where you start to see the difference between Western and Chinese culture. Whereas something like that for, say, in the UK would be too blatantly nepotistic almost, even though our own government, you know, for example, our own government is filled with people who all attended the same schools and universities, all know certain people, all have certain ties, work in the same sort of businesses. It doesn't feel unnatural to call them out and say, that's really nepotistic, that's really, you know, blatantly favoring certain kinds of people and other people should be given a chance. Whereas in China, it goes without saying that you would hire or you would staff your own government with people with whom you're already close and who you already have that relationship with, and therefore you can trust either to back you up or to help your career go further in the future. There are some other ideas that are also important in forming the concept of guanxi. So one of those is something called mianzi, which literally means face in Chinese. The idea of face in Chinese culture is kind of like perception, so both your self-perception and the way other people perceive you in like a social context. So this would include things like being embarrassed or being praised or being undermined. Any situation can contribute or take away from your face. So you can gay mianzi, which is like to give someone face, so to like raise their social status. And you can also diu lian, which means to lose face. Lian is another word for face, and diu means to drop or lose. Again, the way face works differs depending on like the social hierarchy of the situation. So if you're, say, out for dinner with your boss and you notice that your boss makes a mistake, like he misspeaks or he says something wrong, you would not correct him in front of other people. You would either pretend that nothing had happened or agree with him even though you knew he was wrong, to avoid him losing face, because that's just the way that guanxi relationships work. By undermining him in public, you would also hurt your own guanxi relationship with him, and then that could hurt your future sort of job prospects and things like that. And generally speaking, the better your mianzi, the better your face, the better your social status, so the more highly people will regard you, either as someone who can be trusted or someone who speaks well. These are all things that are highly valued in Chinese social contexts. Another important concept is the concept of renqing, which is basically the informal obligation that is generated every time you make a guanxi connection with someone. So say I do you a favor, we immediately have established renqing between each other. You are kind of obligated to repay that favor, not directly, but it's kind of like a mental note, like that person's done something for me, Therefore, in the future, I will have to repay that somehow in a manner that is directly equal. So say like, I don't know, your car broke down and I had to drive you to work, or I let you borrow my car. You might treat me to a dinner that was sort of like the equivalent level of the value of you using my car for a day, if that makes sense. So it wouldn't be a one-to-one payment, and also you wouldn't say that that's why you were treating me for dinner. You would kind of make it casual, like, oh, let me just treat you this one time, and then I would be like, oh, no, it's fine, and then you'd have that kind of back and forth, if that makes sense. So again, it's a kind of nebulous thing that everybody understands is going on, and it's a society-wide concept as well. It's not just like only certain people do this. It's like there is this general understanding that that is how you behave towards other people, and you keep a mental note of all your Guanxi obligations. Some people even keep physical notes, but we'll get onto that as well in a little bit. So in general, when people are studying Guanxi, because this is a very popular concept, social scientists who study China, they tend to look at 3 different aspects. So that is the interpersonal, so Guanxi at a social level, organizational, so kind of like how Guanxi works in the business world, and also the negative effect or harms of Guanxi, both again on a societal level and a business level. So let's talk first about the origins of Guanxi, and then we'll go on to talk about each of those things in turn. It's generally thought that Guanxi originated from the Confucian concept of developing a prosperous and harmonious society. So going back to Bian Yanjie, he says that in Confucianism, social roles are fundamentally unequal in social status, and a harmonious social order is established and maintained when human actors of different social roles and unequal social status interact with one another according to the Confucian ethical codes of behavior. So what are these codes and what is this hierarchical order? Essentially, there are like 5 main relationships under Confucianism. So they are ruler, subject, father, son, husband, wife, older brother, younger brother, and friends. And each of those relationships has its own way in which the people should act towards each other. Rulers and subjects should be loyal to one another. Sons should show filial piety to their fathers. Wives and husbands should be loving and faithful to each other. Brothers should be loyal to one another, and friends should also be faithful to one another. And then there are also obediences. So, for example, the ruled must obey the ruler, the son must obey the father, and the wife must obey the husband. So it's thought that by maintaining the proper relationships between these different people, society would be harmonious and would be able to flourish, essentially. Because Guanxi is thought to be based on these Confucian ethics, other Asian countries that have Confucian history also have similar concepts of Guanxi. So, for example, in Korea, there's something called Yongo, which I understand to be something similar to Guanxi. And I know that places like Japan as well are quite hierarchical in the way that their relationships work. So even though it's not a one-to-one comparison, these ideas about how society should run and the idea that it is hierarchical and there are reciprocal ways of treating each other based on your social standing and your relationship to another person is a common concept in East Asia, and I believe in other parts of Asia as well. Essentially, it's not as prevalent in the West because post-Enlightenment, we believe much more in individualism, and we believe that society should be equal, so there is equality among every person in society, even though we don't always enact that perfectly. That's a fundamental core concept in sort of Westernism, if you will. Another difference between Western societies and East Asian or Chinese society is the idea of how your actions might affect the group. So, like I just mentioned, in the West, we were a bit more individualistic. In China, it varies quite a lot depending on where you live. But when I was doing my PhD, something that I understood, especially about Chinese villages in the 20th century, is that people's Guanxi connections, their relationship with their kin, and their village members was so important that it could even erase the notion of the individual altogether. So every action that you took would be first for the group's sake, because if the group benefited, then you would also benefit, right? For example, if you're a farmer and all of your family works on the same piece of land, then any effort that you put in will directly affect how much, say, food your whole family has to eat for the rest of the year. Also in terms of doing things wrong or like morally grey areas and things like that, because the West is more individualistic, we have a more like guilt-based society is how it's often framed. So for example, if you do something wrong, or the thing stopping you from doing something wrong would be because you would feel guilty about it. So, oh, I shouldn't steal that because that would make me a bad person. Whereas in Chinese culture, it's more shame-based. So I wouldn't steal that because it would bring shame or dishonor to my family. And that's also why in Chinese history, you see often collective punishments were carried out. So if one person did something wrong, the entire family would be punished. You even see this in the Maoist era, where if, say, one family member was a member of the Nationalist Party in the 1920s, the entire family would receive a black label, even if, you know, it's like the person's brother or they had nothing to do with it or whatever. And in the Cultural Revolution as well, entire clans were wiped out just for being associated with one person who had done something bad in the past. Those are kind of like the origins and how Guanxi works at kind of like a very basic fundamental level. How it can be used personally to get what you want is kind of like the next level up of Guanxi. So you've got like how Guanxi works, and then you've got how Guanxi is used. One of the most common uses for Guanxi is kind of like getting ahead, getting the job that you want, for example. So even in the Maoist era, people would use their Guanxi connections to try and get what they wanted, even though technically under communism, those sorts of Confucian ideals, the reliance on personal connections was supposed to be erased and everyone was supposed to be equal. Studies have shown that actually it kind of got a little bit worse because obviously under communism, people don't want to be flattened or people don't want to be constrained or restrained. They do want to try and get ahead. So people who had been assigned good jobs would use their Guanxi connections to get their relatives or kin members good jobs also. So this is an example again from Bian Yanjie. He shows that in a survey that he did, over 45% of respondents had relied on some sort of favoritism in their network to secure a good job during the Maoist era. So here's one example. A parent's friend was a personnel director who helped me behind the scenes and was decisive for a job assignment to a desirable work unit. It was harder to get a good work unit assignment within the Bureau of Railway Administration to which I was assigned. I got help from the chief of the Bureau's labour office, who was a good friend of one of my mother's brothers. I was extremely happy to be assigned as a conductor at the Tianjin-Shanghai route. That was the best line managed by the Bureau. So something interesting that example shows as well is how kin and non-kin relationships can kind of work together. So this person says that it's their mother's brother's friend who ended up getting them a job. This person has relied on kind of their extended kinship Guanxi network in order to get what they wanted. So yeah, so it shows that, again, Guanxi networks are kind of interconnected. So a close Guanxi connection of yours could also use their Guanxi connections to help you in your situation. So it's kind of like the 6 degrees of separation thing that we talk about in the West, except it has a more instrumental direct use. So something else that Bian Yanjie says about Guanxi is that Guanxi is a personalized relationship, and there's nothing to do with Guanxi going on if a relationship is confined to formality. The point to be conveyed here is not so much about who is related to whom at what levels. Rather, events of personal significance are opportunities to assess the nature and quality of Guanxi networks of ongoing social relations. This kind of brings us on to the next point, which is how do you actively build up and maintain your Guanxi connections with other people? So there are a few different ways that people can build up and maintain their Guanxi ties. The first one is something that's referred to in China as banquets. This is kind of like a weird one because in the Chinese idea, a banquet can range from anything from like 20 plus people, either like a wedding or a really formal work event where you go with lots of people and there's like an order of seating and, you know, the person who's hosting sits at the head, the main guest sits next to them, and then everyone else is sort of fanned around them, you know, in like a round table, Chinese style, until, you know, the lowest ranking person sort of sits at the end of the table with their back facing the door, really far away from the host. And then it ranges all the way down to like a dinner between 2 people. So it's not about the size, really. It's about what the occasion is, what the relationship is between the 2 people, and why the dinner is happening. So like a dinner between two friends normally would not be considered like a Guanxi dinner unless one person, say, as I gave the example earlier, was taking the other person out, deliberately paying for the bill in order to maintain that Guanxi social tie. And then maybe next time I would take you out and I would pay for the dinner. So you've got that continued sort of back and forth. Whatever we pay is basically exactly the same. You know, if I paid 20 quid one time, you would pay like roughly 20 quid the next time. In the grand scheme of things, we would have paid the same amount over time. In terms of sort of moving up a level to a senior colleague, or if you're a student, your professor has invited you to their house to have dinner and, you know, their wife cooks you like a lovely homemade meal or something like that, and it's just like a small dinner between you, that would still be them giving you Guanxi. But in that case, it would be more a case of they're patronizing you to an extent. So they see you as somebody close enough to them to invite to their home, to bring kind of into their inner circle, and then you would probably have more detailed and deep conversations, more personal conversations. You're building up a relationship that's not just all about work or all about your studies. You're getting to know each other on a personal level, and then that would take your relationship to the next level, whereby once you graduate, say you're a science PhD or something like that, they might help you get a job through one of their connections. If you're publishing work, you would put their name on your paper, and you would probably put their name before yours, so it looked like they did most of the work, even if you did most of the work. So you have these little subtle ways of paying each other back after establishing that first connection through a banquet. The next level up from that would maybe be like a work banquet, so maybe 8+ people. Say, as a teacher in China, even as a Westerner, you are expected to go to these. They are incredibly boring, but the food is incredible. So there you go. From a Western perspective, they seem overly formal. So for example, if you were poured a drink, you wouldn't just drink your own drink while chatting to other people. You would only drink when someone else is drinking, usually somebody higher up than you, and you would also cheers them every single time you drank from your, you know, really tiny like baijiu cup. Even if you were drinking beer, you would only take like the equivalent of a shot every single time. So they can feel really like unnecessarily restrained. And you know, you've got the big lazy Susan in the middle with the plate spinning, the head person. So say if you're a teacher and you're going with your colleagues, the person at the head would be the most senior teacher. Perhaps they would have invited along like a deputy head teacher or something like that. They would always serve themselves first or be served by someone else. Someone would always be pouring them alcohol. When you cheers them, you have to make sure that your cup is a little bit lower than their cup. If they talk to you, you have to pretend that you're interested and that you're paying attention. There might even be an informal speech or two or something that they want to say to the whole table. So there are loads of like little formalities that you have to pay attention to, especially if it's a work situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about the consequences of too many of these sorts of dinners a bit later on. As a foreigner, you probably won't have to attend that many. I think I went to one every month or so, maybe even less than that actually. But it is still something that you're expected to do, and it's much worse, obviously, for white-collar Chinese workers. And then other types of banquets would be like a wedding. So if you're invited to somebody's Chinese wedding banquet, that's actually quite a big deal. And then the tables, a little bit like a Western wedding. I know sometimes people are like, you can sit wherever you want, or there is no seating. But in Chinese banquets, the seating arrangement, the table number is really, really important. It may not correspond necessarily to your actual relationship with someone. So like you might sit some of your close friends further down than you would sit, say, a senior colleague who you work with, who you're not actually that close with, but you want to maintain a close Guanxi relationship with, if that makes sense. And your friends will understand that as well. So yeah, the banquets, there's a full spectrum of banquets. So if you are going to China and you are meeting up with Chinese people, this only applies when you're in China, by the way, but if you are meeting up with Chinese people in China, try and gauge what kind of situation it is. If it's a work situation, it probably is a bit more formal, and it's probably best to err on the side of, you know, respecting all the customs and cultures. If you're just going out with friends, don't worry too much about making social faux pas, because chances are, as a foreigner, you'll be let off, so it's fine. The other major way to build and maintain Guanxi is gift exchanges. Again, this is more between Chinese to Chinese people, because I've received gifts from Chinese friends before that I haven't necessarily given back. And I have, now looking back on it now, I have not used my Chinese friends, but like kind of relied on our Guanxi and our closeness in ways that I haven't paid back for whatever reason. Or maybe they feel that I have because I helped them translate something into English. But it is quite common to receive like just little gifts from your Chinese friends. Those aren't always things that you have to repay in terms of Guanxi. You can just accept that, and then like if they need a favor from you, you can repay it that way. But among actual Chinese people, these things are like calculated really precisely. So for example, the hongbao, the red envelopes that you receive at Chinese New Year, first of all, depending on your relationship to the person, it should be a certain amount. Depending on your marital status, it should be a certain amount as well. So married people who have been married for a while have to give more than newlyweds, who have to give more than single people, who have to give more than single people who are younger and have only just started working, so on and so forth. You'll probably get the most from grandparents, for example. And the amount that you put in a hongbao directly impacts the amount of guanxi that you can have with a person. So if you go to someone's wedding, and when they came to your wedding, they gave you 50 yuan, and you go to their wedding and you only give 20 yuan, that's a diss. Basically, you're signaling that we are not as close as you think you are, or perhaps they've upset you in the past, and that's the reason why you're kind of slighting them a little bit there. And then the last way is favor exchanges. I've given a few examples of this before, but that's kind of like the very, very basic way. So if you were to put them in kind of like a order of hierarchy, I guess the favor exchanges would be at the very bottom. That's kind of like, they can be day-to-day stuff all the way up to helping someone find a job. And then you've got the gift exchanges, and then you've got going out for banquets. So those are all ways that you can actively maintain your guanxi ties on an interpersonal level. So if you're someone who's going to China, perhaps that's giving you some ideas of what you can do. There are differences between how guanxi works in China, first of all, between different social classes, and then between rural and urban people as well. First of all, between different social classes, obviously it's kind of works the same as in Western society. The higher up you are, the more guanxi that you have, because your network is bigger, you are more important, so people want to get to know you more. If you're like a white collar worker, you probably have the most guanxi connections as compared to like a laborer or like someone who's self-employed in a trade or something like that. And then between urban and rural, I would say in a rural context, guanxi is still a bit more formalized, because in an urban context, obviously there is more individualism. Guanxi is probably a little bit more instrumental as well, so the kind of like relying on your colleagues or your friends, getting ahead in your career and things like that. Whereas in rural contexts and villages, it's still a lot more favor-based, interpersonal, affective. So there is an author, Yan Yunxiang, who did an in-depth study of a single village in North China to kind of summarize how guanxi worked at the village level. He described it as kind of like a ritualized exchange of gifts for gifts. I mentioned earlier that some people keep a very detailed list of what gifts they receive and give to other people. So this is the study where he discusses that there were some families who kept ledgers, literally detailing every single gift that they got from people, when they got it, how much it was, whether or not they had paid that back yet, usually for like a wedding or a funeral or something like that. So keeping very close tabs on that. It's more important at a village level also because it takes up a significant portion of people's salary. So he mentions that there are 22 gift-giving situations, each of which necessitate gifts from different groups. So gifts of love are mostly associated with marriage and thus indicate the boundary of conjugal family. Gift giving for ancestor worship is strictly confined to close agnates, so people descended from your father's line, while the annual, say, village parade involves all villagers and thus stands for the whole community. So all of these different events that are happening basically all year round can cost the average person, say, up to 1/5 of their annual income. So they would actually put aside that money every single year in order just for guanxi maintenance. Like that's the whole purpose of that chunk of money. And they know this in advance and they budget for it as well. I think even though guanxi is more effective in the village setting, it is actually more instrumental as well, or rather the instrumental uses are heightened. So for example, at an economic level, things like interpersonal loans or asking for help, say with planting or with a harvest, literally borrowing labor from another family is a really, really big deal. So yeah, borrowing money, borrowing labor, moral support, or literally receiving food from people during times of disaster. There's one author who writes all about how during the Great Leap Forward, families with better Guanxi links, especially in other villages, were more likely to survive than people who either didn't maintain Guanxi links because they were socially ostracized, or people who had taken on that full communist ideal of, the old society is dead, we don't need concepts like that anymore, everyone is equal and we're all moving forward. Because those people had literally abandoned their connections, when it actually came down to the wire, the study shows that the people who had no Guanxi connections and were cadres, but not high enough level cadres to get favors from the state, were more likely to die than people who secretly maintained connections, even if those people were sort of black labeled families as opposed to sort of red good families. The author also outlines the fact that there is a strong delineation between people who have Guanxi and people who don't have it. And people who don't have it at all are known as 四面子, which means literally dead door. He goes on to describe it like this. These charges mean that someone has failed to establish a respectable place for him or herself in village society, thus showing a lack of knowledge of what it means to be a proper person. The term 四面子 therefore symbolizes both the incompatibility and inflexibility of these persons and, at a deeper level, their social death in the domain of social exchange and Guanxi cultivation. So Guanxi can actually be a matter of life and death for people. So it is that serious, even though it is somewhat of a difficult term to define. So let's move on now to talk about Guanxi in the business world. Possibly more than in a social context, Guanxi is extremely important for doing business in China, especially if you're starting from scratch and you're trying to create a new startup venture or something like that. But just in general, Guanxi is very, very important. So according to one study, China's economic reform and open door policy have not restrained, but rather have catalyzed a proliferation of Guanxi. Along with the transformation of the centrally planned economy into a market-oriented economy, people in power find that power itself relates more to personal benefits via power exchange, while people without power can also share the benefits through some particular connections to those in power. 权力 Guanxi, which is power-based Guanxi, in essence is institutionally defined and reflects the authoritarian state's organizational hierarchy. It's equated to bureaucratic corruption and is often synonymous with nepotism, patronage, or factionalism, and works as an important power base that represents saved favors, faces, and special relationships with powerful or rich people. Much like villages that I discussed earlier, organizations will often deliberately allocate resources towards cultivating Guanxi, either with other businesses or particularly with government officials or government agents. So by resources, I mean time, money, and personnel. So specific people will be allocated, usually the managerial class, to going out and creating favorable relationships with other government officials or with other business leaders. Inviting them to banquets is usually the main way that that's done, or going out drinking or whatever it is, and sort of building up personal relationships at the managerial level, which can then be applied to the business case. This is quite important in China because of the lack of institutional strength and kind of weak rule of law. So this is again why I said if you're from an emerging country or a semi-developed country where interpersonal trust is important, so somewhere like Nigeria, for example, would be a good example, where the government's rule of law or the institutions are quite weak. And so people rely quite heavily on who they know to get ahead or to do well in business. And in China, this kind of like bleeds into corruption as well. Not just bold-faced corruption like bribery in order to get a better deal or bypassing certain laws in order to get your business off, say, paying taxes, but also just like small nepotistic things. So things like getting hired, getting a loan from a bank to stop your company from going under in bad market conditions and things like that. Having the right people on your side is very crucial in these instances. Often, someone wrote that when you are applying for a job as a manager, often something that's taken into account is not how well the company did or how well that part of the company did under your management. People will actually look at what connections do you have? Like, who do you know? Why should I care about you? What can you bring me other than just working hard, right? Another study by Bien shows that in 3 different case studies, regardless of profitability goal, employment size, and organizational complexity, each company under investigation relied rather equally on their central player's Guanxi circle as the governance structure. Furthermore, when someone was permitted to enter the Guanxi circle and exercise a certain degree of managerial authority, both the job competence and personal trust of this person was simultaneously evaluated. Business Guanxi is kind of like an amalgamation of lots of different one-to-one personal ties or lots of different social networks. And again, it's about the instrumentality. So how these can be leveraged in an actual business case to get the business ahead. Something that somebody asked me in the comments on YouTube. By the way, I often post about what I'm going to be talking about next on YouTube, and then I let people comment any questions or things that they want me to cover. So do go over to YouTube if you have an idea about what I should talk about. I'll try and let you know in every episode what I'm going to talk about next so that you can come up with ideas if you want to let me know. A really good question that somebody had asked me is, do Chinese companies use Guanxi when they're going abroad? Do Western companies use Guanxi in China? So this is a really good question because, as you would kind of expect, when you're going into a culture, your business needs to assimilate to the cultural practices of that country. When Western businesses are coming into China, it's very, very important for them to start establishing Guanxi. Otherwise, their business will essentially fail, regardless of how big their business is, right? So there have been cases where things like, McDonald's have been kicked off the land that they were going to develop on because a developer like Li Ka-shing has said, actually, I wanted to build there. That's actually happened before. I think in Beijing, actually. There are times where having the right connections are necessary, even to just bring your business into China. There are so many rules and regulations. I think one article said that you need at least 10 different approvals at different official levels to get your business into China. And you will not get there just by applying, or you'll be under more scrutiny if you don't know the right people. Whereas if you know the right people, you can get the stamp the same day. So it's a matter of speed, it's a matter of efficiency, and it can be a matter of like thriving or packing up and going home for many companies. I think when we're thinking about Western countries going to China, I think a certain level of cultural relativism has to be applied here when we're thinking about whether or not it's ethical. I don't know about you guys, but in my company, we have a lot of training for this sort of thing, Even the smallest gift that you receive from someone should be rejected because that could be seen as a bribe. If you see your competitor's, quarterly statement on a screen, you should look away and pretend that you've never seen it, sort of thing, because everything has to be done fairly and justly. Whereas in China, these things are a bit more grey. Like, if you can get your competitor's secrets by leveraging a Guanxi connection, why wouldn't you? So here are some case examples of when companies have said that cultivating Guanxi in China has been absolutely necessary for them to get on. So here's the Australian Sydney Corporation, which is a lubricant manufacturing company's account. In the beginning, we advertised heavily in newspapers and magazines, but nothing came of it. We then tried to send sales agents to various cities to push our products. But because we had no established Guanxi, the effort was in vain, even though we spent a lot of money on the operation. Later, we developed Guanxi with a person in charge of a division in the Department of Commerce in Beijing and hired him as a consultant. He introduced us to a local distributor who is his Guanxi Hu. Subsequently, the distributor agreed to put our products on the market, but only because of his Guanxi with the consultant. His personal assessment of the quality of our products was largely immaterial. Here's another manager of a Chinese wood and bamboo company. Guanxi played a very important role when we tried to bid on a construction project in Kunming. The person in charge of the project would not schedule an appointment with us because we did not have Guanxi with him. It did not matter to him that we had the best lumber, the best engineers, and the lowest bid. He refused to even meet us. We had to find an intermediary who had Guanxi with him to get an appointment to discuss the project. In China, one does not simply barge into someone's office and start making a presentation. One must have a guide in order to get to know the other party first. In this article, the authors kind of give you like a structured guide as a Western company who are trying to establish Guanxi in China. So they say things like finding an intermediary is a good start, usually a consultant who can serve as a go-between, someone who's very well connected. Send your managers out to spend social time with other managers in different companies. And that's before you even start doing business with them. So I think from a Western perspective, that would be seen as what we like to call a waste of time. But from a Chinese perspective, having the relationship first and the business second is just the way that it's done. Somewhat surprisingly, the prestige of your firm, the size of it, doesn't matter as much as, how flexible you are, how personable you are. You can be Audi, you can be Yves Saint Laurent. There are plenty of large companies. I think Johnson & Johnson have struggled in China and haven't really been able to make that much headway and have lost out to Chinese competitors because they just don't know the right people, and they felt that being a big brand, people would necessarily want to work with them. And that's just not the case in China. It's way more about, again, how these personal connections can be leveraged for the business case. So let's flip to the reverse of that now and think about whether or not Guanxi is important for Chinese companies entering foreign markets, particularly Western or European markets. A study conducted in 2017 found that Chinese companies had an additional barrier when entering European markets, and that barrier was the perceived lack of quality of goods or perceived poor service standards of Chinese companies. So China still has that image of like made in China products breaking easily, being really shoddy, being badly made, etc. They had this extra barrier. It wasn't so much a problem in emerging markets. Again, going back to countries like India or Latin America, in Africa, where interpersonal ties are still quite important when doing business or when working in politics. In European markets, it's way more about proof of concept, meeting the expectations in terms of product, in terms of services, before then going on to establishing a longer term relationship and that personal connection. However, in general, managers did find that their previous knowledge of Guanxi helped them to develop long-term ties. So instead of just having, a one-off business contract, getting to know the other side would help them long-term in their business. So from a Western perspective, for Chinese companies, it was more like you had to take the time, get the knowledge, do the business first, and then you develop the relationship, the Guanxi, the connections afterwards. So here's what one manager had to say. It's a long way and a patient accumulation process of knowledge about building relationships in Europe. On the one hand, it's about establishing mutual sympathy. On the other hand, it's a rational collaboration. But without knowledge and skills, no one will listen to you. It's a matter of time and knowledge. Even though the Europeans don't understand face, but also things like renqing can be taught. Yes, people are all the same. At the end of the day, they all emphasize the value of Guanxi. However, you need to bridge the cultural distance first. Trust is a condition for establishing Guanxi, and in Europe, of course, there is mistrust. Only time can solve the issue. So one thing that managers did quite a lot is they would do things like provide the first service for free, or give a big discount on products, or fly European managers out to see the facilities and the production process in order to establish the business trust before then going on to try and make a personal connection with them. So this is another account. People are all the same. Don't think that Guanxi matters only in China and business people outside of China are very professional. That's not the case. Once you're in the upper levels, where people have established long years of relationships, you are one of them. And there's a big difference between talking about business inside those circles and talking about business when you're outside of those circles. I'm representing our company in that circle. I just asked them for the handicap, asked them if they do sports, asked them about their family. But you need the business relationship first. You can't just call the CEO and ask him to play golf with you. Even when I leave the country and a new manager replaces me, he will still be part of this circle because he represents our company. And that means our company is part of the circle. So that's kind of how Chinese people view Guanxi in a business context. They see it, even though they're going to a different culture, Guanxi is still important. It still plays some role, even if it's interpreted differently by Westerners. But as we noted earlier, there is that sort of ethical, moral grey area with Guanxi, and then obvious areas where it slips into actual corruption. So let's kind of discuss some of the social and business harms and difficulties with Guanxi. So if we go back to the study of the village, I mentioned that the gift giving could cost up to a fifth of an average villager's yearly income. Something to add to that is also that for poorer villagers, Guanxi gift giving would take up a higher percentage of their annual income, so up to like 20% or more, than if you were richer, it might only be 10%, because of the reciprocal nature. So if someone poorer than you only gave you 10 yuan, even though you're richer, giving them 10 yuan wouldn't be seen as a slight, it would be seen as matching their energy, if you will. And then obviously if you're higher up and you're looking to get something done, you would have to give more. There's an example of a village party secretary who had tried to get his daughter an urban hukou, and so had been giving lots of guanxi to lots of different officials in lots of different areas, and that was really a drain on his income for that year. Depending on who you are, it can really be a drain. And actually during the communist era, that was something that Mao tried to stamp out. He tried to stamp out ritual offerings made to dead people, and also guanxi gift giving, because he saw that this was kind of keeping peasants economically behind, because they weren't able to save and they were always in debt, and they weren't able to get out of their poverty because they were spending their money, in his opinion, frivolously. Because of the social embeddedness of guanxi, it even seeps into things that are supposed to be meritocratic. So for example, if you take like the gaokao, which is supposed to be the most meritocratic thing in China, it's the university entrance exam that every university potential student takes, and your test will determine which universities will accept you. There's been a lot of controversy about things like people stealing other people's identities, or people using like other things that they've done like sports or music or whatever to get extra points on the exam and eclipse poorer students who have worked hard but don't necessarily have the extracurriculars to push their scores up to get into the best universities. So interestingly, reading about those stories about university students kind of getting ahead through their connections, because in the case of the stolen identity, it was like 10 different people who worked in like the post office and the administration office all helped this person to steal someone else's identity who had done well on the test. And the reaction was less shock and outrage, as we've seen in cases like in the US quite recently, and more like, oh, well, I wish I was that lucky and I wish I had those guanxi connections. So it's so interesting to see that guanxi is so socially embedded that people doing things to get ahead using their guanxi is just seen as like a matter of course, essentially. And not maintaining guanxi can, you can end up socially ostracized, or it could really hurt your job prospects. And this is becoming more of an issue in China recently. So going back to the banqueting idea, like I said, going to these dinners after work can play a huge role in either maintaining or building up your guanxi with higher ups. While it can be bemusing from our perspective, it's very serious for Chinese people, and you can get harassed for not attending. You can be abused if you go and you like don't drink alcohol properly. There's cases where women have been inappropriately touched by senior staff members, and young pretty women are kind of brought as like an exchange, very creepily and grossly. Like the prettier you are, the more likely you are to be invited to these things, and like you'll kind of be offered to the other managers, sort of like to sit next to a senior official who's really important and who's going to help the company get ahead by giving them a rubber stamp on something. You sit next to him and you chat him and you let him make inappropriate remarks about your looks and like touch you and ask you to go somewhere with him, and you have to dance that fine line of being like, I have to do this for my job and I have to be flirtatious, and at the same time being like, this is awful. And it can cost you your life as well. We've seen this recently in China, where there are stories of people who have drunk so much of these things that they die. So here's one story, I think from earlier this year. A Communist Party official in the northwestern Qinghai province died after sharing 7 bottles of liquor with 5 other senior officials, the party's internal discipline body announced. Drinking culture is deeply rooted in China, as rejecting toasts or merely drinking slowly in the presence of higher-ups can be deemed disrespectful. More junior employees may be forced to drink at work events, and even insulted or attacked should they refuse to do so. Authorities have tried to clamp down on this pervasive social problem in recent years. The Civil Code, which came into effect in 2021, specified that pressuring others into drinking or failing to send drunk people to the hospital is now illegal. But the problem has been difficult to stamp out among party officials themselves. In 2013, the party banned high-end alcohol at work banquets, which was followed up by several local governments banning alcohol from all workplaces and events. According to local media estimates in 2017, at least 21 officials have died from overdrinking in 4 previous years, 7 of them because of the desire to please higher-ups. So, speaking of workplace guanxi obviously has negative effects for the business world in general. So, according to Ying Fan, it's safe to say that there is no business Guanxi network that is not tinted by corruption, and no corruption without using Guanxi. Inside China, Guanxi is the synonym for corruption and other wrongdoing such as nepotism, bribery, and fraud. It's acknowledged that these things are negative and have a negative influence on business and cause people to do either illegal or just morally shady things. But despite that, it's very hard to clamp down on this stuff. We know that one of Xi Jinping's flagship projects has been the Catching Tigers and Flies campaign to stamp out corruption, especially among officials. According to several studies, corruption and bribery have actually only increased under Xi Jinping's rule. So a 2022 study from Manchester University found that not only being connected to the political elite in China brings advantages to firms, despite the launch of the anti-corruption campaign, but that connections have become more valuable for private firms following the launch of the campaign. By contrast, for state-owned firms, the importance of the connections didn't increase, but state-owned enterprises themselves can act as these sort of means for political interests to get ahead. Things like pyramid schemes are banned in China, like MLMs, peer-to-peer selling and stuff like that, because people have used and abused close Guanxi networks and ties to completely bankrupt people and drain their entire life savings. Pyramid schemes are seen as shady in the West, but they don't have kind of like the scrutiny that they do in East Asia. I have watched so many dramas where the plot is literally somebody has given their life savings to someone they thought was a good friend in a pyramid scheme and then lost all of their money and weren't able to do anything about it because they were afraid that calling out the friend or, like shaming them in public would bring shame onto themselves. So they just kept it to themselves or like committed suicide out of shame. And this is seen as like a perfectly normal way to behave in that kind of situation. Finally, Guanxi is not necessarily good for businesses themselves, even though they need it to get ahead. It's kind of like a sunk cost fallacy in a sense. Like the more you spend on Guanxi, the more you need to spend on Guanxi. And then it's just this ever-evolving circle whereby as the market economy takes hold in China and the competition grows ever more fierce, the need for Guanxi and these sorts of connections, bribery, sort of shady, unethical goings-on at the workplace or in these banquets just gets worse and worse. Here's an example of how bad it can get. A manager in a private company had to spend tens of thousands of renminbi each year improving his Guanxi with local officials. If he didn't, he would not be granted an export license, would not get a bank loan, and would not even have the electricity and water supply to run the factory. Clearly, in this case, the firm was forced to maintain its Guanxi, and gifts are actually forms of extortion and bribery. In some cases, it gets so bad that you're bribing people not just to get ahead, but to keep the lights on. And yeah, I think we can all agree that that's moving away from the sort of moral or cultural relativism into just bad practice. With all of that in mind, is Guanxi going to go away? I think it would be very difficult to erase such a strongly embedded cultural practice because it's not just something that people do, right? It's a mindset. Like I said at the beginning, you kind of keep a mental note of what your connections are, how they're connected to you, how they can be instrumental, what their feelings are for you, what you can do for them, etc. Like it's ingrained from you from the very beginning. If you see it all around you, it's difficult to kind of get rid of that. Having said that, you do see younger generations rejecting normal social conventions more and more. We've seen in recent years concepts like sang culture or tangping, lying flat, where the youth are just rejecting all sorts of cultural pressure, societal norms and things like that, and are instead either pursuing their individual desires or just like removing themselves out of the rat race altogether. However, I think at a societal level, it's still very prevalent. It's kind of like if all the wealthy and famous and successful people are doing it, it kind of gets copied by people who want to be in the same position as them. So I think we've got a couple more cycles of the Guanxi connection stuff to go. I mean, Mao tried to erase Confucian values from China, but he didn't succeed. So maybe capitalism will win where he failed. Who knows? But that's it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. This was very, very long. This is why I don't do culture episodes, because it took me over an hour to explain one concept. So yeah, I hope if you're studying for a test, you can just quote the entire script, I guess. And that would be enough to get you ahead. But I hope that that's given some clarity. I think Guanxi, because it's so fundamental to Chinese culture, that potentially sheds light on lots of different ways that Western culture and Chinese culture differ from one another, and potentially explains lots of things without having to go into every single, potential interaction between people. If in doubt, the problem is Guanxi. So the next episode is going to be about the Chinese property market. So a few episodes ago, we did an episode on the history of Chinese urbanization. So this is kind of going to be a part 2 to that, more modern, talking about things that have happened in the past few years, the problems with the Chinese property market, will the bubble burst? If so, what's going to happen, etc. I'll post about it on YouTube. So if you've got any questions or any topics that you want me to cover